Compared to SPS corals, LPS are easier to keep, just as colourful, have far more varied growth patterns, and most importantly, add movement to a saltwater aquarium that really makes it feel like a living reef. So while my new 6-foot tank is cycling, I've drawn up a list of my 8 favourite LPS corals to help with my stocking list, so I'll share those with you today. And if you're here for inspiration for your next LPS coral, I've included 8 honourable mentions at the end that you might love too. Now this list is in no particular order, but first up is chalices, which are pretty hot right now.
So hot right now.
Chalices mostly grow in a plating pattern like this watermelon chalice, but some also have a kind of melting pattern whereby they grow downwards and slowly smother and encrust the rock they're on. I've generally found chalices to be reasonably hardy, and it's rare that any of my chalices die, although they do sometimes sulk a little bit if my water parameters are off. And they're on this list partly because of the variety of colours you can get, but also because whatever colour you do get, they seem to be uber bright, especially under blue LEDs. They can be quite aggressive, and the worst offenders will almost instantly kill any coral that comes into contact with them, so it's worth giving them a bit of personal space. Next up is Favias. Unlike some of the melting chalices, Favias are a proper encrusting LPS coral that cling to the rockwork. These have been super hardy for me, and they've put up with swings in salinity, calcium and magnesium. Now there's plenty of colour variety with Favias, although this Fascination Favia is my personal favourite. I haven't found them to be particularly aggressive or stingy, and the only thing I'll say is that the group of corals us reefing hobbyists call Favias are really made up of a bunch of different but very similar looking corals, so there's every chance some of the corals in these clips aren't actually Favias, and closed brain corals is probably a better name. Next on my list of my favourite LPS corals is the Trumpet coral. And if you're looking for a hardy LPS coral, this is one of the easiest to keep corals on this list. But the reason it's one of my favourite LPS corals is because it's just so damn bright. This bright green trumpet coral I got from Prestige Reef is quite simply the brightest coral in any of my tanks. I had to turn the exposure down on my camera a couple of stops to dull the effect, and the image is still too bright. And if that's not a good enough reason to buy a coral, I don't know what is. Moving on to number 4, and we have Blastos. In the past I've struggled to keep Blastos, but my 2 current frags are growing out nicely and retaining their colours. Tidal Gardens say that these are very low light corals, so it might just be that this is the first time I haven't overcooked my Blastos, but whatever the reason, they are uber fluffy and have a really vivid deep red that I don't see in many other LPS corals, which is why they make this list. Number 5 on my list is Scolys. Now unfortunately for me, you can't get the nicer Scolys in the UK anymore, and I just have 2 Scolys that I bought a few years ago. They make this list because they're one of the fleshiest, puffiest corals that I have, and because they're also the hardiest on this list. I find them super tolerant of imperfect water parameters, and you can recover them from close to death simply by feeding them LPS pellets. This is what my Warpaint Scully looked like when I first bought it, and while it took a good 12 months to recover it, all I did was feed it, and it now looks super healthy. Into the final 3, and we have the jiggliest coral on this list, the Space Invader pectinia. And I've specifically chosen the Space Invader pectinia because most other pectinias aren't as bright and are a bit more bland. This is another coral I've found to be pretty hardy, and it's never shown any signs of stress in the 18 months I've had it, despite me taking my eye off the ball with my parameters a number of times. Now while I haven't seen this myself, I'm told that they have long stinging sweeper tentacles, so it will need a bit of space from its neighbours, although mine hasn't done any damage yet. The penultimate coral on my top LPS list is the jack-o'-lantern leptoseris. Again, there are other types of leptoseris, but none are as bright as a jack-o'-lantern. I've had 2 colonies of this for several years, and I've never had any problems with either of them, and they don't sting their neighbours or send out sweeper tentacles. And while it's not quite as bright as my trumpet coral, this was pretty much the brightest coral in my last tank, so if you like corals that glow brightly under blue LEDs, look no further. Before I get to my number 1 then, I'll cover off a few honourable mentions. There's the hardy, fluffy John Deere Leptostraya with its unusual green and yellow colours. Encrusting maze corals, the prettiest of which in my opinion is this green and purple one. There's the hobby staple that is the acan that I left off this list mainly because I find their rainbow colours difficult to keep. There's the disc-shaped fungias with their squidgy stubby tentacles, the ultra meaty trackies, which was probably the closest honourable mention not to make the main list, the stunning and rarely coloured red and yellow burning banana Stylociniella, another bright encrusting coral in the shape of Cyphastria, of which there are many fancy colours, and finally the coral that many of you will have expected to be my number 1, torch corals. I do love the colour, growth patterns and flowing movement of torches, but I hate how expensive the nice ones are, and in my experience they are the most difficult to keep coral of this entire list. So my personal favourite LPS coral is the Goniopora. In my opinion, the shape of the polyps and lashes, the flowing movement and the variety of colours make Gonis the most beautiful LPS coral in the hobby. Now in terms of difficulty, they're second only on this list to torches, and while I have now got to the point where most of my Gonis thrive, it's still not uncommon for one of them to wither away for no obvious reason, and they're one of the first corals to sulk when my water parameters are even slightly off. Now I've mostly isolated my Gonis away from other corals because they have a reputation for being a bit stingy, although I personally find bernardporas more aggressive towards their neighbours than Gonis are, as well as being more difficult to keep than Gonis. Now because Gonis are so tricky to keep, they're certainly not for the faint of hearted, but if you can get them right, there's nothing better. Now frankly there are so many awesome LPS corals that this probably could have been a top 50 list, and I haven't even included corals like the Duncan coral, Catulophilia or bubble corals. So if I've missed any of your favourite LPS corals, share them in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next time, and until then, happy reefing.